So when I first made the switch from Final Cut to Premiere, one of the things that I missed the most was the Lumetri color panel. You've got dedicated sliders for nice things like vibrance and exposure and saturation. And these things make color grading so fast and so easy. And unfortunately, there's no true equivalent for them, at least I don't think, in Final Cut. So I started to think that perhaps it just wasn't going to be possible to get the same results in Final Cut that I was able to get originally in Premiere. But I just decided to bite the bullet after a while, you know, because I was just like, I bought Final Cut, I'm going to commit. So it really forced me to go back to basics and use the fundamental tools of color grading like curves and color wheels. And I was just frustrated by this because I felt like it was really slowing me down. But I'm grateful now for that experience because it made me realize how reliant I had become on LUTs. Too reliant, in fact. And that was the thing that prevented me from really seeing color with a critical eye. And ultimately creating my own unique color grading style. And that is the thing that I want to encourage you to do as well. Now, I fully believe that how we treat color as visual storytellers matters a lot because it can have a pretty big effect on how our audience perceives the story on an emotional level. So when some of you recently commented that you like my color grading style and asked how I do it, I felt really honored, so thank you. And that is the whole reason for me doing this video right here, right now for you. The framework, how I approach a color grade. So generally speaking, there are three things that I like to do to my footage when I color grade, and those are first, make it warmer, second, apply an upper S-curve, and then third, add a blue-yellow color contrast. Number 1, make the color temperature slightly warmer. Warmer to me is about creating a mood that is a bit more inviting and welcoming to you as the viewer. And I also feel like making the footage warmer is just more flattering on human skin tones in general. Number 2, add an upper S-curve. So most of you probably already know about the cinematic S-curve. It's just a way to add more contrast. Now I like to take that up a notch by exaggerating the upper part of the S-curve. And this just adds a bit more drama to the highlights and works really well when you have a subject that's backlit. It just really adds that extra punch. Number 3, apply blue-yellow color contrast. To me, this is where the magic really starts to happen and I get to start to have more fun, particularly because I just feel like it's a bit more unique than the teal-orange color cast that you hear get talked about so often. I just find a blue-yellow color contrast to be a bit softer and actually even more dramatic because I feel like there is a greater difference in luminance between blue and yellow versus teal and orange. So it creates an even wider color contrast. Now, I don't really have a way to scientifically prove this, so you're just gonna have to take my artistic word for it. So let's take it into Final Cut and see exactly how I apply that in terms of nuts and bolts. So I've got 3 clips loaded here so you can see how I apply that framework to different situations. Generally, what I like to do is dedicate a different layer to each intention, and you'll see how this plays out in a little bit, but I'll start with the color board, and with the exposure here, I've got my scopes here and I can correct the exposure essentially. So from here, I will sort of play around with the shadows and the highlights to get something a little bit more dynamic. So there we have that. And then I'll go into color wheels, and this I will dedicate to saturation. And I found that color wheels is generally the best tool for playing around with the saturation because it gives the most leeway. I just like the way that it works in terms of saturation. So from here, what I like to do is just like turn it to an ungodly amount, then from here tone it down. So generally like around there. I will go in and just kind of play around a little bit with the shadows and the highlights. I'm not going to show you guys how much time I spend on stuff like this, but I do like to just sort of, play around with it. You get the points. And then from here, I will actually add another color wheels, but this one I will dedicate to the color temperature, like I said before, and I'll either play around with this, but since this is a human subject, I'll manually either punch in 56 or 5700, generally speaking. And the advantage of having two separate color wheels layers is that I know this one was dedicated to saturation, so if I ever needed to affect the saturation, I could go back into this layer and either turn it off and on and see how it affects everything just in terms of the saturation, or I can go back into this and play around with this. And this is something that I've just learned from experience, because sometimes I've wanted to go back and change something, but I didn't know, did I use the wheels for that? Did I use color board for that? I can't really remember. So generally, having a different intention on a different layer tends to work out, organizationally speaking. And these are the fans turning on my MacBook Pro right now. So if you hear them, it's because I'm screen recording and color correcting at the same time, which is taxing on the processor. So I apologize for that. From here, I will then go into the color curves, and this I will dedicate to the upper S curve that I talked about earlier. So generally that's about turning up the midpoint, just, in this case, it would just go slightly while keeping the shadows at where they are. I will add another point of control in the highlights area and just sort of play around with these two. Sometimes this needs to go a little bit further down, sometimes it needs to go a little bit further up, but generally speaking, I would say let's right around there or so, and let's change this to a different, it looked a little weird right there. Okay, I love this mix control right here. It means I can keep the general curve of what I like, and I do like this, but it's a little too much, so I'll turn it down. And there we go, I'll turn it down to about 63% right there. And again, I do like to, every now, as I go on, just turn this off and on to see how all of my decisions now stacked affect the color grade. So then from here, I'll add another color curves, and this will be for the blue-yellow color contrast that I talked about. I'll just go to the blue channel and turn that down to add more yellow, and then turn up on the shadows to add the blue in the shadows. Now, this is obviously too much too, so I'll be able to turn down the mix here and probably leave it around there or so. And now you can really start to see another advantage of having this one intention per layer approach, because even though I have two color curves, they serve two different intentions. The first one, again, was about the upper S curve, whereas this one is about the blue-yellow color contrast. And there's a really subtle difference right there. Let me turn this all the way back up so you guys can see in a more obvious way. So there's the upper S curve, and this is the blue-yellow color contrast. Same tool, but two different intentions. And then from here, because this is a human subject, I will go into the hue saturation curves and play just a little bit with the skin tone. So I'll pick a color from the hue versus saturation curve. Just turn up the saturation slightly. Obviously this can go into Donald Trump level right there, but we don't want that. Right there, just to add a little bit more life to the skin. Again, very subtle. And then I'll go to hue versus luma and do the same thing, pick a color from the skin tone and turn it down. And what this does is it gives your subject just a little bit of a tan. We want to give our subjects a little bit more life here. So now I can turn that off and on, and you can start to see a bit of a difference right there. And if it ever turns out to be too much, again, you can always go down to the mix slider and turn that down. But yeah, let's drop this down to like 88% or so. That's pretty much it for this type of clip. So that's all of them off and then all of them on. And because I have a different intention for each of these tools, I can easily go back and change them. Now, moving on to this landscape clip, we can do the same thing, right? So I'll start with a color board, correct the exposure, check my scopes. You can see there's a lot of leeway in the highlights, so I can turn that up and turn down the shadows to bring that down closer to 0. but I do like to leave just a little bit of leeway right there. And this is before and after. And then we can take care of the saturation using color wheels and turn that up. This is really desaturated, so I'm not afraid to turn this really up high. And again, this is something I would spend more time on in terms of the shadows and the highlights and the midtones for the saturation, but you kind of sort of get the idea. I'm going to add another layer for color wheels, but this time play with the color temperature and probably leave it. Actually, I could even turn it all the way up, right? Don't be afraid to push it to the limit. And it's still not quite warm enough for me, actually, if you can believe it or not. But like I said, warmth can come in through many different ways. So we'll go to color curves and add our upper S curve. And yeah, that's right about there or so. This is starting to clip a little bit in the blues and the reds. So I'm going to turn that back up just to give a bit of leeway in the shadows. And we'll add another color curve for our yellow blue color contrast. Now here is where the warmth comes in another dimension, particularly in the highlights. And sometimes I'll leave this flat, sometimes I'll play around with the blue curve and add a bit more yellow in the midtones either that way, or add a bit more blue in the midtones this way. So I do like it slightly warmer. That's flat, and then this is curved, but that's a little too much of a curve, so I'll do it that way and maybe tone down the mix just slightly. That's about it. Actually, bonus tip here, right? So obviously there's no human subject, so I'm going to take away the scopes just so I can see this maximized. I want to bring out the greens and the yellows because this is a really gorgeous shot that was shot in the autumn up in the redwoods in Northern California, so I want to emphasize those. So I'm going to grab the green from the trees and turn up the saturation there. Can't really see a whole lot. And then I'm going to grab the golden yellow from these trees and turn that up. And now that really adds a nice punch. And so this is a big dramatic difference in a short amount of time, right? So before and after, before and after. Pretty proud of that, and we can just play that back for a few seconds. Beautiful. All right, so let's end with Duncan's Behead in Scotland. And this, because it was shot on the X100F and uses Fujifilm color science, which is just amazing. We're not gonna have to push it as much as we had to for this Humboldt River shot, as you'll see. But I do still like to apply my own look and feel. So again, go into the color board, bring back our color scopes. And here we can see that the shadows are already clipped just slightly. So I'm gonna bring that up a little bit. And I could technically turn the highlights up here, but I do like having just a little bit of leeway there. So I'll leave that as is and then go into color wheels and play around just slightly with the saturation. Saturation is already pretty good, so I don't need to push it all the way like I did in the last clip. And add another one for color wheels this time, play with the color temperature, turn this up. And I know I'll add more warmth through the blue-yellow color contrast, so I'll just sort of leave that right there. That's before and that's after, so it's a little bit warmer. And then add a curve for our upper S curve. And this I do like to play around. So this gives it more of a bleach bypass kind of look if you turn up the midtones, versus if you turn up the highlights or the mid highlights, then this really affects the sky only. But I kind of like that bleach bypass look here, so I'm going to turn that up, but it's a little too much, so I'm going to go down to mix and turn that down just slightly. All right, that's before and after. Dramatic difference right there. And then we'll add another one for color curves, this time affecting the yellow in the highlights and the blue in the shadows. And now that's starting to look really cinematic right there. before and after, and then let's just check everything before and after. So that's a noticeable difference, not as dramatic as the other one, but still pretty good. Okay, and then from here, I'm pretty much done. I don't feel like I need to emphasize any individual colors, so I'm gonna skip hue saturation curves. And that's another thing to remember, is like you don't have to do everything all the time. So if we go back and just kind of play, you can see there's a general look that starts to have a certain kind of consistency between these three. There we've got human subject, river, and coastline. I mean, if this were a true professional job, then I would spend a lot more time trying to equalize the looks between all three of these. But I think that it does have a general consistency because I had a framework to begin with and just applied to them according to taste. So there you have it. I hope that was helpful for you. The lessons I've learned along the way. And along this whole color grading journey and learning how to do it more manually in Final Cut, there are a few lessons that I've learned that I'd like to share with you. Lesson 1, do color first. So after I've loaded my footage into Final Cut, color is actually the first thing that I work on. It's the first thing that I address. And I do this for two reasons. The first reason is that color just helps me to connect emotionally to the storyline before getting into the nitty-gritty of the edits. And the second reason is that practically speaking, it's just easier to do this now versus later. Otherwise, I'm having to copy and paste color grade settings from one clip to many teeny tiny little small clips versus working with a single clip that's already been color graded. Lesson 2, take short breaks. So this is about just taking the time every now and then to look at other things in your room, looking outside the window. And the reason for this is because it is so easy to get sucked into your own color grading vortex and end up in a totally weird space. Trust me, I've been there before, and this can prevent you from going there. Lesson 3, take a long break. So even with taking short breaks every now and then, I have found that sometimes I'll come back to an edit a day later or a few days later or a week later after having not looked at the footage for quite some time, and it'll still look weird, you know? I'll sometimes be like, why did I make that creative decision? It looks so bad. So I also think it's key to just kind of sleep on it and come back to it a day or a few days later. Lesson 4, don't sweat the small stuff. Now this is where I would find myself wasting the most time because I would just agonize over these teeny tiny little decisions of, you know, should I set the color temperature to 5000 K or 5500 Kelvin? And it is true that color grading is essentially a series of stacked decisions, meaning you make all these little adjustments and over time you end up with a grade that has a pretty significant difference between the ungraded and the graded version, and the intention is to have a particular emotional effect on the viewer. That being said, you have so many other things to worry about as a creative, and what I've learned is basically to just split the difference. You know, if I'm undecided between 5000 Kelvin and 5500 Kelvin, I'll just split the difference and set it to 5250 K, call it a day, and move on.
Hello, morning light, climbing through my windowsill, dancing on the tile, warming up winter's chill.
Now this is where I have learned the value of balance, essentially. You know, on the one hand, you have the option of using a LUT from somebody whose work you love and trust. Just set it and forget it. On the other side, you can take matters into your own hands and do what I've shown you here, which is, you know, create your own style, your own color grade. And you can take this to the extreme too, you know, agonizing over every single little creative possibility and going nowhere. Now, what I've learned is that most of the time, it's best to find the balance between these two extremes. Now, there is a time and place to keep things simple, especially when you're first starting out in your creative practice. On the other hand, endless possibility can quickly turn into just an inability to move forward and make some progress. And what I found is, after I've experienced both of these extremes along my creative journey, and it can happen repeatedly, it depends on what you're learning or what you're getting used to. It's so important to go back and find that magical center in the balance. And that's what I'd like for you to think about in your own creative practice. Have you left the training wheels on for a little too long? Or are you just banging your head against the wall and agonizing over trivial decisions that ultimately don't really matter that much? How can you go back and find your center?